Phoenix is like every other city. As it has grown, the temperature has gone up. And because many of the world's weather stations are situated in towns, the temperature record is potentially threatened by this effect, the urban heat island phenomenon.
We've been able to detect heat islands in cities as small as 300 people. And the second we move into an urban environment, no matter how small, and begin to replace the natural vegetation with concrete, you would create something of a distortion in the temperature pattern. It's an effect that can add up to 2 or 3 degrees. And if we look at the issue of global warming, and we say how much warming do we think we should have seen or will see in the future, it's on the order of 1 or 2 or 3 degrees.
Dr. Balling has studied urban heat island effects in hundreds of cities throughout the United States.
We have to be careful when we look at people who say, I have detected global warming, because what they may have detected is urban warming.
Professor Wigley defends his data and plays down the urban heat island effect.
You can estimate what that residual effect might be, and we believe that it's quite small.
I agree, it is a small effect in terms of the total area of the globe that's being affected by urbanization. The problem is that most of our measurements come from these areas.
And an awful lot of the weather stations are in towns, aren't they?
A number of weather stations are in towns. There are a number of ways that one can account for that problem. The obvious way is just to eliminate those stations from the data set that you use to calculate the large area average temperature values.
But presumably there must be lots of towns where you don't have data from around them, so it's very difficult to tell whether there's been an urban effect or not.
That's right. And I should say that this is an area of ongoing research and still of some concern.
Dr. Balling's results would seem to justify that concern.
We looked at 1,000 stations in the United States that came from very small towns, averaging no more than about 5,800 people. And we looked at the temperature pattern from those cities over this century. We found out that most of the United States has cooled this century, not warmed.
Furthermore, new data from space has made the land record more doubtful. Until recently, we've had no alternative but to rely on thermometers and weather balloons. But now, for the first time, satellites are giving us another source of information. Dr. Spencer at the NASA Space Center has been able to analyze satellite data to produce snapshots of global temperature, each one equivalent to tens of thousands of separate thermometer readings taken by hand. In February of 1983, the hottest areas are clearly visible over southern Africa and Australia, while in August, the warm areas shift into the northern hemisphere.
We've found that we can monitor globally averaged atmospheric temperatures with a high level of precision, even on a monthly basis. We're estimating the precision at about 1/100th of a degree per month.
Unlike the thermometer data, the satellite information is evenly spread and does not suffer from the urban heat island effect. Over the last 10 years, the thermometer record has shown an underlying upward trend. But according to the satellite information, the Earth was rather warmer in the first half of the 80s and rather cooler in the second half.
The trend in the thermometer data is only about 1 to 2/10ths of a degree, which doesn't sound like much, but it's enough to be a significant difference with the satellite indication of no trend. Over the entire 10-year period of time, there was no net warming or cooling.
For the first time, satellites have given us an alternative to the land-based data, but they show no increase. So there's a flaw in the first pillar that supports the greenhouse theory. The urban heat island effect and the satellite information point to question marks over the data on which claims of warming have been based. But even if we accept the thermometer data as accurate, whether there's been a temperature increase or not depends on the timescale you choose. Would you accept that over the last 10 years there's been no overall increase in global temperature?
No, I wouldn't accept that. But that is a question that may be irrelevant in the greenhouse context. The greenhouse effect is a century timescale warming.
The warming Professor Wigley is referring to comes from this graph of temperature over the last 100 years, which shows an underlying increase of 0.5 degrees Celsius. The problem is that the trend depends on the period you choose to examine.
If you started it someplace else, if you ended it at someplace else, the trend changes. And so it's clearly not a record you draw a straight line through and say this is warming.
You mean that if we took the last 50 years, then it would tell a different picture?
Yes, absolutely. Last 50 years, it does nothing. Went down and then went up.
And if we chose the years from 1930 to 1970, the average temperature actually falls fairly sharply. We don't have the data to extend the graph backwards much beyond the last 100 years, but there is evidence that there have been times when it's been warmer than it is today. Medieval records show that vines were grown throughout Britain, and remains of a beetle, a species of nettlebug, has been found in York 1,000 miles north of its current habitat in the Mediterranean. So if we had thermometer records going back for 1,000 years, it could well show a fall in temperature since then, rather than a rise. Doubts over the data and problems with the time base have led Dr. Rizzo, who studied the effects of carbon dioxide on climate for the past 20 years, to be dismissive of claims that the world is warming.
Some people claim that there may have been a 0.5 degree centigrade warming over the last 100 years. This is really tenuous. You look at the real world, let's say over the past 100, 150 years or so, and you find that there has been no significant warming.
But perhaps more than global temperature rise, it's been predictions of increases in sea level that has encouraged impressions of impending catastrophe. Entire cultures are apparently faced with disaster.
As the children play, year by year the waters are rising around them.